Hey, so this is a little bit of a different conversation. We decided to just read a paper together and talk about some ideas. But before we get started with that, maybe you want to introduce yourself.
My name is Mirko Prokop. I'm a second year, just about starting my second year PhD student, interested in everything related to agency, cognitive science, and trying to, in particular, find a sort of naturalistic angle onto the notion of intention and intentional action within the context of more recent approaches in the cognitive sciences that maybe we'll get to talk about today a little bit.
Yeah, we're going to look at intention.
I'm excited to see where it goes.
So we met in Portugal, right? At the
conference.
Yeah, it was a philosophy of mind conference. So we just realized that we both have a lot of similar interests, but we're coming from different places. So we thought it might be fun to just have a conversation and see where it leads about some of these issues. And you already mentioned one, which is intention. Another is, we chose this paper. Maybe you want to talk about the name of the paper and introduce that just for a second.
Well, the name of the paper is Intentions in Ecological Psychology, an Anscombian Perspective by Miguel Segundo-Ortin and Annemarie. And I think it was published in 2022 in Review of Philosophy and Psychology. I guess we can put it in the show notes. And it's an interesting paper because it tries to introduce, as I understand it, an approach in the philosophy of action that used to be a bit unorthodox or maybe misunderstood for a while by Elizabeth Anscombe into the field of ecological psychology, and tries to sort of bring these two fields together. And I thought that was a really interesting proposal. We're not going to be able to really dive deep into their arguments, I guess, but it might be just
set up a few of these like bigger terms. So like philosophy of action is one, and then we have Enactivism, and we have ecological psychology. Those are maybe three.
Enactivism is sort of the perspective that I bring into, or that's sort of what I'm working within. I'm not sure if the authors of the paper would identify themselves as sort of an activist. I think they're coming mostly from this ecological perspective, but it would be good to clarify.
Well, I think there's maybe Chimero and Boggs. I think those papers are referenced in this paper. Actually, I'm not entirely sure, but there's been this movement probably in the last maybe five years of trying to figure out how enactivism and ecological psychology fit together. And I found a lot of those themes coming up in this paper, which basically comes back to this idea of the cognition that's kind of like the sandwich model of Elizabeth Hurley, her kind of that she makes fun of, versus this kind of direct perception of something like a Gibsonian point of view. I think there's a way in which these have been thought of as opposites, especially when it comes to something like action. And of course, in the philosophy of action, I mean, maybe you can speak to this a bit, but it's this idea of that intention, for example, would be something mental going on in the brain, which wouldn't fit with ecological psychology, because that would be like a direct perception. So you wouldn't have the sandwich thing happening between perception and action. But again, this is another thing I hope we can explore a bit, because I feel like even in this paper and definitely in the literature, what is perception and what is action? And are they opposites? Are they different things? Are they, what are they? What is the relationship? I think this is actually usually at the heart of these discussions and of this paper too. And that's kind of the dichotomy I'd like to talk about.
Yeah, I completely agree that's sort of, I think that, and there are a lot of ideas in the paper that speak directly to this kind of contrast or dichotomy that I guess we can talk about. Yeah, maybe it would be good to just introduce the ideas of ecological psychology, some central ideas that to frame the discussion, like the notion of affordance, for example.
I guess we should talk about ecological psychology. Well, first of all, neither of us are trying to be experts, so feel free to disagree with whatever we say here. In fact, we welcome that because that's part of it.
Yeah.
But just kind of trying to talk off the top of my head, that's all we're trying to do here. And then I would say ecological psychology is this embodied, situated, non-representational approach that, of course, is mostly associated with J.J. Gibson, although his wife worked a lot on it later, and there's different notions of it depending on what you read and which time you read it and who you read. But I think in the big picture, from my point of view, we can say non-representation is very important, which means they don't believe there's representations in the brain that are necessary for perception and action, and that it's situated,
I guess a different,
contextual.
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
No, I think I was just thinking, I often find that divide between people saying, "Oh, I'm an anti-representationalist. I think everything about cognition is about representations in the brain and so on." I mean, people use these terms very differently, and I often find it more confusing than helpful to draw these kind of sharp distinctions. But so I was just thinking, a different way of thinking about specifically the notion of, or the understanding of perception in ecological psychology as something that's not necessarily mediated, so that when you perceive an object or a situation or something, it's not like there's a step between the perception and then the processing in your brain, and then you becoming aware of what's in front of you. It's just that the perception of what you see is sort of direct in this non-mediated sense. And if you have that view, I guess you can dispense with the notion of representation and say there's no need for some sense internalizing what you see in terms of this mental item that's called a representation that can then be worked on inside your brain. But yeah,
and that's where it gets into
way.
a lot of trouble, of course. That's where the Gibsonian framework is so criticized, because even just the way we, in a very common everyday sense, we feel like we have thoughts which don't seem, that direct perception account doesn't seem, if you put it in the most kind of cartoonish way, doesn't seem plausible. Of course, there's tons of literature about this that really gets into the specifics, but just for an everyday kind of approach, like you do feel like there's it's not that there's just perception and action. It does feel like there's something like rumination, for example, that could happen, as if this mental action isn't action, it's something different. And this is where a lot of these debates come in about, as far as I understand it, ecological psychology in the Gibsonian sense, especially J.J. Gibson, was kind of this third way, right, between cognitivism and behaviorism. So you had this behaviorism model where it was more, let's just study behavior, which might be associated with this, okay, it's just action. There's nothing going on in the brain. We're not going to think about that, because it was then associated with consciousness, right? And that was kind of thought of as like, you can't touch on that. It's too mystical or spiritual, or you don't need it, right? Just study behavior. And then you had the cognitivism, which was sort of went the other way around and started really focusing on cognition as the subject and thinking more in terms of it, language and mathematical models and the brain. And this approach went the other way. And I think the ecological approach, at least what because as you know, I'm coming at this from my own research, and so are you, but what interests me about the ecological is J.J. Gibson's early writing, where he's talking about trying to overcome this dichotomy of mind and body, or mental and physical, or cognitive and behavior, and to see this in a very different way, which is a really hard thing to do, and to come up with a way of seeing that isn't linear and isn't fitting into any of these places. And I feel like ecological psychology was trying to do that in the beginning. But then, of course, it's got all these different interpretations about affordances, perception, action. Yeah, so I don't know how that relates to your work exactly, or what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm not too familiar with ecological psychology and the early writings of Gibson, although I would love to read. It's definitely on my reading list.
Yeah, you're more coming at it from the intention. You've read a lot of Anscombe, right? And
well, I've tried to read her book Intention a few times. It's very,
a few times.
I mean,
Wow.
yeah, I guess I read it, but or at least certain sections of it. But many people say it's a lifetime exercise to really try to understand it properly.
Yeah,
But
well, all of this is right.
it's definitely, it's very inspiring, and I think it's a great, the authors in that paper, they do a great job of trying to bring her kind of perspective, which initially seems a bit hard to combine with a naturalistic approach to the mind and to action. And they try to bring that perspective nonetheless into a field that, ecological psychology thinks of itself as a kind of scientific approach to the mind, I guess. Yeah, and that's why I found it very interesting. But I do think it leaves a lot of questions open still. And
yeah, let's get into what the proposal of the paper is. But first, I know we mentioned affordance, you did, that we should sort of think about that. And basically, affordance is usually defined as opportunities for behavior. It's basically sort of what, from a particular subjective point of view, if we go with like von Oekschool, for what that subject's environment or Umwelt, which is different from environment, affords it for behavior. So it would be very different, for example, for if we think of a river and some logs and grass. For a human, this would afford certain things like perhaps exercise, maybe beauty, things like this. The log might be a place to sit and rest. For an insect, it would be completely different. It might be a home, it might be food, and so forth. These are kind of the opportunities of behavior which are relative to the subjective body. That's how I see it. Do you have anything that you'd like to add about that?
yeah, I mean, yeah, I think my basic understanding is exactly what you said, that, but perhaps a different way of thinking about it is that it's also an understanding of perception that's inherently sort of relational, so that you have to consider the kind of bodily structure of the agent in order to make sense of the particular kinds of things that the environment affords to the agent, or the kinds of behaviors that it enables the agent to do. So a tiny toddler, for him or her, you know, that's a staircase might be like a mountain. So it's something that they have to climb up with their hands and feet and so on. Whereas for us grown human beings, it's something that we can step on and walk up. But for the toddler, the way that it perceives that staircase is very different from us. So it affords different actions. And of course, then if you think about between different species, the difference might be or is even greater. You know, that I don't know, I'm not able to climb as a monkey, so a monkey might perceive some particular kind of tree as perfectly climbable,
according to its body. Yeah,
like
so
directly, yeah, affording climbing up or escaping from a predator. And I don't, because I just don't have the bodily capacities to do that.
Yeah, it's good
So
you
that,
bring
yeah.
up this relationship is important, right? Between the body itself, not just some kind of subjective idea of a
Yeah,
perspective, but
so
the body itself, yeah, and the environment, right? This is an important part of enactivism, of ecological psychology, of philosophy of action. It's body, it's environment, it's this relationship, right?
Yeah, I think this is where certainly my understanding of ecological psychology merges quite well with sort of the enactive perspective that I've worked on a bit and then I'm interested in, because as I understand it, it thinks of cognition as something that is always a relational process between the organism and its environment. It's not enough to just look at sort of one part of the equation, let's say, you know, the brain, and then try to figure out what cognition is, because if you think of it in that relational way, you always have to take into account both the structure of the environment and the structure of the agent that enables this kind of complex, dynamic, intelligent behavior to occur. And I think that's an understanding of cognition that Enactivism certainly shares.
Yeah, and to go to von Oekschool too, a lot of people say niche construction started with him, but you could also trace his work to other things. But what comes through is like what you were saying, that there's a particular kind of body and a particular kind of context, which then you can't dissociate perception and action from that. And when you were talking, I was thinking of these loops and cybernetics and how all of this is a similar tradition, right? That kind of leads into enactivism and ecological psychology. And that also kind of starts with von Oekschool, who also talks about these loops between a body and the environment. I'm not sure loop is the right way, because that sounds like you come back to where you started. And I think in terms of dynamical systems and complexity, we never come back exactly to where we started. But in any case, the idea of this looping between a body and an environment as part of the perception action structure, some even call it the perception action loop, is really important in all these contexts, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to also say that, you know, Van Oekschool, you've mentioned him to me, and I've heard about him, but he's definitely also an author that I need to read more, and that is on my reading list. But just what went through my head as I was listening to you, what you were saying about these, you know, perception action loops or cycles, is that what I've sometimes found is that, especially when you then start to think about agency, it does seem to introduce a kind of asymmetry in that relationship, in the sense that an agent is sort of like the active part of that relationship. If you observe an organism, how it behaves in its environment, even an organism that we might think of as something relatively simple, a tiny fish or something, they're moving about, they're exploring, they're doing things. And of course, if you have a sort of ecological understanding of cognition, then you want to say that not everything about that behavior can be explained just by looking, like by dissecting the fish and looking at its tiny brain and nervous system and doing experiments with it. The environment is certainly important, but then at the same time, it seems to me when we think about agency that it's still sort of the fish who's the main actor, who brings forth this kind of relationship in a way that makes that organism the source of what's going on, and in a very important sense, the sort of seat of the intelligence. So even though on an ecological approach, you do get this idea that the structure of the environment is very important, and you can't just look at the brain or just the organism. But then when you start to think about agency, to me it often seems like, but there is definitely some kind of asymmetry, that what happens within the organism at that time of the action, or perhaps in general in relation to the concept of cognition, is the, I don't know, central place to look, I guess, when you try to explain agency. You know what I mean?
That's really interesting. What do
you
you
don't
mean
want
by
to end up.
What do you mean by asymmetry there?
I guess what I mean is that you don't want to end up in a place, and I think this relates to some things they talk about in the paper, where everything that an organism is doing is sort of triggered by the perception of affordances in the environment, without the organism having some way of, actively mediating between which kinds of affordances it perceives, which affordances it acts on.
Exactly.
Because otherwise you end up with a kind of very mechanistic view of what's going on, where agency just kind of doesn't seem to have a place.
That's what I was sort of referencing earlier as the main critique of ecological psychology, or of a direct perception, let's say, because there's many different ways of defining ecological psychology, but of direct perception, right? It's exactly that there does seem there's something else, right? And if we define things in these kind of binary ways that we're used to, which in my work I'm trying to get out of that, like you would be able to understand cognition as scaled rather than on or off, or only there or not there, so that if you really take everything we've been talking about into consideration, the body as it's developed historically and evolutionary, in terms of evolution, but also of that body itself, be it an insect, a fish, a human, whatever it is, then its interaction over time and space, which is another important part of all this, the way that the creature experiences time and space is something that a lot of these writers talk about, even going back to von Uck's school, about how you define perception and action in the first place. But then you could have many different kinds of cognition. And to get to your point, that kind of mediation that you're describing could easily develop out of those loops for something like a human, for something like an animal, in a sense, because it wouldn't be different from the way that you are making through that environment or that context or that ecology. At some point you might become aware of those patterns. The agent might become aware of its own patterns. Some people say cells already do this, right? But and in a way, we could understand this kind of middle sandwich thing between perception and action, as it feels for us, as another loop of that. And Enactivism sort of starts to do that with sense making, for example, starts to kind of think of it in those terms. But
although I think, I mean, my research project when I started this like about a year ago, was also coming out of a bit of a dissatisfaction with the notion of sense making, for example, as being this bringing forth of meaning in an interaction that an organism has with its environment, as sort of the basic understanding of cognition. And I should say, that I don't think that,
I'm so glad you said that.
That's all Enactivism has to say about what cognition is,
No,
but
of course
it is
not.
a very, very wide understanding. And even though I really like, or I'm a fan of thinking about the continuity between us and other organisms, there do seem to be very significant differences in the way that we, for example, are able to, I mean human beings, are able to act in the world as opposed to a tiny fish or even a bacteria or a cell. And I think that, one thing they pick up in the paper, which is really important and which I'm interested in, is this notion of intention. That also throughout the history of philosophy, I guess, that there's been a kind of, as I understand it, idea that intentional action proper, like acting on a reason, intentionally knowing what you're doing, whilst you're doing it, with a particular goal in mind, and being aware of what you're doing and able to explain what you're doing to others if they ask you why you're doing this, that's a kind of capacity that is unique in some sense to humans, or specific. And I'm not really sure if that's the best way to think about the notion of intention, but it does seem to get at something that is important to we need to explain when we want to understand certainly human agency, and perhaps also agency of other animals. And well, I guess one way that we could that they pick it up in the paper, in that I think relates to what we talked about just before, is this idea that our intentions do seem to affect the way that we perceive the environment and the way that we perceive certain affordances rather than others. So if I'm, let's say in a beautiful city, I'm a tourist and I'm just looking around and wanting to see everything, but in that particular moment extremely thirsty, then what I will be looking for is not the nice architecture or whatever, but my whole perception is going to be sort of geared towards finding something to drink, like being a water fountain or a shop where I can buy some water. I think the idea that they want to bring into the paper is that just talking about affordances is not really enough to explain the way in which intentions affect the way that we perceive the environment. Because depending on the kinds of goals that I want to achieve in a particular moment, I really just do see or feel or taste or whatever different things. And so there's this sense that the intention really changes the way that we relate to the world.
Yeah, and that gets to the idea of agency too that you were talking about, because agency basically is like control over the perception action cycle. It's different from an agent, but having agency. So in the way you're describing it, sounds more like something like Descartes or Hume or Hobbes, where it's like the intention is almost like a desire or a drive or something that's then guiding the organism. And as you brought up before, there's also a way in which you could, like, let's say you're a meditator and you could maybe sit with this desire and maybe overcome your thirst or something like that. And that seems to be that mediating middle thing that we're talking about. How do you see that in terms of intention?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just the desire, but it's also a really a conceptual, or maybe, a way in which your perception is affected by your intention. So I think, in the standard view in the philosophy of action, you often have these two kind of components that people think that are important to make sense of the notion of intention. The one being the sort of conceptual belief component, that when you do something in order to achieve a certain goal, the idea is that you have some kind of belief that what you're currently doing is maybe the best way of achieving what you want. But then on the other hand, you also have, of course, this desire component, the affective component, or the emotive component, which is already, in this word emotion, the kind of thing that sets you in motion, that actually brings you to act, and that's also essential to making sense of intentional action. And often, people tended to think about these. I think Hume, for example, might have thought about these as relatively distinct in the explanation of action, this like conceptual and the emotional affective aspect, which is something that is, I think, characteristic of a lot of maybe traditional cognitivist views in the cognitive sciences, of thinking of intelligence or cognition on the one hand as something that's not directly related to affectivity in the way that things feel to us, and on the other hand of thinking about things like pain and affect. And I'm certainly interested in thinking about these two things as much more interconnected than maybe the standard account of action or cognition seems to suppose.
Yeah, there's so much in there I want to talk about. I want to think about philosophy of action and the Davidson view versus the one they're presenting here. But maybe first we should just give a little abstract of the paper. I mean,
Yeah.
What is this paper actually sort of trying to do? What's the issue at stake here?
Yeah, so I guess that they see, as I read it, the notion of intention kind of lacking in ecological psychology, or at least more sophisticated explanations of what intentions are. People mention that notion a lot, but they don't really elaborate. Apparently, that's what they say, what it really amounts to. And they want to say that it's important precisely because of these kinds of examples that I've given, that intentions do affect the way, or they affect which of we actually perceive in the environment in a particular moment, depending on the kind of goal or intention I have. And so it's not enough to just talk about affordances, but you also have to bring in this notion of intention. And then they
I guess we
want
should say too that just we didn't mention it before, but in ecological psychology, I mean, a lot of people say that one of the main things it's trying to do is explain agency, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if we said that, but we connected. I mean, we talked about agency, but yeah. And so you're saying that this paper's kind of saying, okay, but in that like explanation of agency, we don't talk about intention. Or if we do, we talk about it in a Davidsonian sense, but okay.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point to mention that we should have said earlier. That, I mean, the notion of affordance in some sense tries to bridge this like classical sandwich model that you've mentioned earlier, between like that try to distinguish between action and perception, by saying what perceive are not sort of objects that are neutral to us, but what we actually perceive are affordances, which are possibilities for action. So if I look at a chair, I'm not just seeing some kind of neutral object, but I'm seeing something to sit on. If I have the goal in that moment to find something to sit, then that chair will give me the opportunity to realize that. So it will afford me sitting. I think that's the whole idea, and that's why the notion of affordance is inherently related to agency. But then in the paper, they want to go a step further and say, well, but then when we start to think about intentions and the way that our goals affect our behavior, which particular intention we're trying to realize in a given moment actually restricts the kind of affordances that we perceive, and which is what I tried to explain with this trying to find water case. And so I think they want to make the point that, well, you need to provide some kind of account of what intentions are, to make the story of ecological psychology complete in explaining agency.
Yeah, exactly. So it's trying to use Anscombe's work to explain what intentions are, but also to ecological psychology would say, okay, I mean, it wouldn't fit with thinking there's some representational state or like internal mediation if you take it as direct perception. So they're also, aren't they also in this paper saying, okay, well, with Anscombe, we can not only provide a definition of intention, but we can show that it doesn't necessarily need to be representational and therefore could work with ecological psychology rather than Davidsonian intention, which would require this sandwich thing, right? Something mediating or representational, I think is how I understand it. How do you?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. So I think they first make this move of saying, well, we need to start thinking about intention in ecological psychology. And then they ask, why hasn't there been more discussion of that in this particular literature? And one reason that they offer is to say, well, because of the fact that most of the most influential, what's sometimes called the standard account of action, which is often attributed to Donald Davidson, do think of intentions as, well, mental things, mental objects that, as I said earlier, are often thought of as these pairs of beliefs and desires, but they are still in the minds of the person who is acting at a particular time. And Davidson actually emphasized a lot that this idea that intentions cause behavior. So he wanted to provide a sort of causal account of that. And if you have that view, I think the authors think that that's hard to square with ecological psychology, because it has this kind of anti-representational approach and wanting to not think of cognition as, or things like intention as, something that primarily takes place in the mind of an agent.
I wanted to ask you, this is something that confuses me. Maybe you have some insight on, but in what you were just talking about, or in a Davidsonian model of philosophy of action, how do we really distinguish, like, as I understood him, and I haven't looked at this literature in a while, but it seems that action is always something that's been mediated in a mental sense, right? So it's not like movement. It's not just an movement. That action, the way we're almost redefining action from a normal everyday use, as action is now the thing that has become mediated. Do we just think of action and movement as not the same thing, that action is always mediated in a Davidsonian sense? And is it the same in Anscombe, or is this paper showing us it could be seen differently?
I think there's a lot of things in there that make it all very complicated. Most people would want to distinguish between action in general and then intentional action. And then you might still distinguish between action in general, intentional action, and then basic behavior. So if you think of something like reflexes, for example, I guess many biologists or people working on the mechanics of reflexes or whatever wouldn't want to necessarily think of that as an action. And if I don't know, snip my fingers next to your eye and you blink, there's some sense in which that's not something that you really do, even apart from the distinction between action and intentional action. I think people have tended to just wanting to distinguish between action in general and then intentional action, which goes back to this question by Wittgenstein in his philosophical investigations, where I wrote it down somewhere. Just so I get the wording right.
Yeah, like the arm thing about what's
so where he says like what is left over when I subtract the fact that my arm goes up from the fact that I raise my arm. And the way that he's phrasing that question seems to sort of suggest that there might be two different kinds of projects or two different things that you want to understand. Like one is me raising my arm, which is something that I do intentionally. And the other thing is my arm going up. So like in the German, it will be the passive, mein Arm hebt sich, in the sense that there's something that the arm does to itself.
So if I throw a ball at you and your arm goes up and you catch it, that would be more like a reflex. But if you have awareness that you're going to raise your arm now, and then you raise your arm, that's intentional action. The first one is just action, and the second one is intentional action, or?
Yeah, the throwing example is interesting, actually. I'm not sure what I would say to this. I wouldn't, I wouldn't necessarily say that I did it intentionally, but it was also more than just a reflex, maybe. Maybe it was something that I'm good at catching balls or something. So some kind of action. But to finish the thought from earlier is that you might think of, on the one hand, there being my intentional action of raising my arm, and on the other hand, some kind of happening in the world of my arm going up. And you might think that intentional action is sort of one happening in the world that we think of it as an action plus something extra, which is then the intention. And so you want to describe that extra feature, and then you have an understanding of what distinguishes intentional actions from non-intentional actions or from just actions in general. I mean, there's reason to think that Wittgenstein thought that the question is not really very helpful. And Anscombe certainly, as I read her, didn't think that it was a good question to ask. So I think she wanted to kind of say that we shouldn't think of intention as some kind of extra feature that is present whenever someone acts with an intention or acts intentionally. And so in some sense, you can't really make sense of the question of what an action in general is, apart from the question what an intentional action is. So that these are kind of interconnected conceptually for her. And so this search for some kind of extra feature in addition to maybe behavior or action in general, for her is, I think, just kind of a misguided approach to understanding the nature of intentional action.
I was just thinking about, as you were talking, I was thinking about how you probably know this too, but often in philosophy, when you go to classes, one of the things you get told or you are supposed to learn is that when we talk about intention, we don't mean it in the way that we use that word in everyday life. Do you know what I mean? Like there's this kind of supposedly different way in which the word is used in philosophy, which I don't know, maybe we should talk about that a bit too. And also just for people who don't care about all these like specifics of philosophy, which, nerding out on it like we do, like, what are we really talking about here? Why do we care about, I mean, I think these are huge things that matter in our lives. Agency and intention are huge things that matter in our life.
Yeah.
And I feel like we can get so caught in just talking about all this like wordplay kind of stuff, which is important too in a context. But I think here I would also like to kind of think of a big picture too. What are we trying to understand? But first, let's talk about that intention. Do you really see that there's some kind of difference between this philosophical idea of directedness in the way that we define intention versus the way we use it in everyday life? Because I even feel like in this paper, the way we use it in everyday life is the way they're using it. But I don't know. How do you see it?
Well, I mean, that's another reason why I find reading Anscombe quite refreshing as well as perplexing, but mostly refreshing, because, well, she certainly thought that these are not just philosophically interesting questions of thinking about the nature of intention, but I think, as far as I'm aware, her thinking about the philosophy of action was, and specifically about the notion of intention, was spawned by the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima. And, President Truman kind of saying, or, someone might have thought that he could have said something like, I didn't do this intentionally. I just signed a piece of paper and I didn't really drop the bomb, so I'm not responsible for this. Whereas she, I think, wanted to really say, no, you are responsible for that. And I guess she thought that the reason for that doesn't hang on a particular mental state that Truman had at the time where he signed that paper, but it had more to do with the way in which he knew that when he signed it, he was actually ordering the bombing, and that Anscombe wanted to think of wants to think of intention as she says, a sort of form of description of actions or events in the life, in human life, which usually is sort of goal directed, of actions being done in order to do something else. So she thinks that whenever we use the term intention, and she's really concerned with the everyday use of intention, there is a kind of pattern present in human life that is, if you like, teleological, so that is concerned with us doing certain things in order to achieve other things.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I didn't know that. About that was
yeah. I mean, for her,
motivation.
these were, I think, really, yeah. I mean,
because I mean, philosophy is a wonderful way to learn how to think critically and things like this, but At least for me, I don't know. I kind of sensed it when you were saying you got a little annoyed with this sense-making thing, but for me, the reason I'm trying to understand cognition is because I want to understand how we might reorient our relationship to self in terms of just the difficulty that humans can feel in their interaction with their own bodies and selves and in social context. That's ecological for me, but also how we can understand, my little dog here and the trees and like all of this kind of life around us as having some agency. And that is always tied to cognition. And that is always tied to these issues that we raised at the beginning about like what's really happening between perception and action. And is there some kind of mediation? And that story you just told about dropping the bombs, right? For me, that makes me think, okay, there's a reason why we really need to know when a subject is aware of themselves as a subject and what has led to what they perceive and also what action follows from that perception. And for me, I feel like a lot of this in the paper and even in these studies, what frustrates me is that it's so insular, that it's as if there was no history, there was no trajectory. This is why I try to bring in this like landscape and trajectory, because I feel like when we really look at all of this, we have to look at a kind of a being as having a trajectory that determines its perception and action, and that perception and action are actually just our ways of assessing something that's ongoing and dynamic. They don't need to be thought of as separate or whatever, just different ways of assessing this. And this gets brought out a little bit in the literature too, but I'm just talking now, but I wonder what you think about that. And if you feel in your philosophical work and study, like how do you balance that, or how do you think about these kind of bigger themes and how they motivate your work? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess I really do think that the philosophy of action, despite being often very technical, and also a lot of the literature that in the last 10 years or so has been, or maybe a bit more, published on like the new Anscombian approach to philosophy of action, rediscovering. I mean, Anscombe published her book Intention in the 50s, but then it's been forgotten for a while. That, or not forgotten, but interpreted in ways that were kind of mistaken. That I was thinking, I was reading that and thinking, that really matters, and I do think that. Also, I mean, I didn't study law or anything, but as far as I'm aware, that German law, or probably in any criminal law, if you want to prove someone guilty of a crime they did something, you have to normally show that they did it intentionally, or at least if they didn't do it intentionally, they would usually get a milder sentence. So it's not like figuring out what the nature of intention is something that has no impact on the way in which
good point. Yeah, that is
structure
how
our
people get
society.
sentenced, right? Yeah.
But I also like the thing that you were saying. I think you were mentioning this sort of continuity of agency across the spectrum of life, and this is something that I find really important to not always look at what makes us sort of distinct and interesting and special as human beings, but also what connects us to other organisms and of their capacities for agency, even fairly simple organisms. And this is something that the enactive approach is happy to embrace to some extent, of ascribing agency even to cells and unicellular organisms. And yeah, I think I'm sympathetic to that. However, as I said earlier, looking at the continuity shouldn't let us overlook the differences that there are, that are very important, because I can't really hold my dog accountable for the kinds of things that he did in the way that maybe I can hold my friends accountable. And that seems to have to do with the form that agency takes in human life and the kind of ways in which we are able to act, which is often related to the notion of a reason. People say, I'm able to act on a reason and to communicate, to explain to you why I did something, which is, something central in Anscombe's work, that she focuses a lot on this question why. And she thinks
that's
that
true.
the actions that are intentional are the kinds of actions to which, as she says, a certain sense of the question why has application, where that sense, where the answer, if positive, gives a reason for what you did. And then she tries to work out that particular sense of the why question. But I can't really ask my dog, why did you, I don't know, wee on the floor or something? And I can't really hold them accountable for that in the same way as I could maybe my drunk friend or something.
That means you can't apply a human definition of cognition to a dog, right? Which I think is what we are all trying to do, or think we can do. That we can just come up with an idea of what cognition is and it's going to apply across the board or something, or that we can come up with a definition of agency and intention. But to go back to those subjects we raised at the beginning, I think what I'm seeing is that you can think of cognition as something that all creatures have without assuming that it's the same. And when we look at something like ecological psychology and enactivism and philosophy of action, I think what a lot of people there are trying to figure out is how to understand that, right? Like, how do you understand that for me, I put it in my terms because that's like what I have to do. But for me, as your dog has a history, a trajectory with its body and its particular affordances, that you could hold it accountable relative to that trajectory. But of course, you can't hold it accountable relative to a human trajectory of cognition. But that doesn't mean that your dog isn't intelligent and cognitive. It just means that takes a lot more work, right? Do you think that connects to Anscombe at all and her idea of practical knowledge, or?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's a lot of things that we could talk about here. I mean, another reason why I found Anscombe nice to read is that she's very open to the idea of attributing intention to non-human animals. And she actually says explicitly, we often do describe the movements of animals in intentional terms. Where you say, like, why is the cat crouching like that? Because it's stalking the bird. And, you might say, well, its intention in crouching is to catch the bird. And that's a perfectly valid description of what's going on. And then people might say, oh yeah, but the intention of the cat is very different. And I think Anscombe also says something like, even though the cat cannot express its thoughts in the way that I can, if you ask me, why are you doing this? We still attribute intention to the cat, and it's perfectly fine. But of course, there is still a difference between me and the cat in the way that I act, or that I'm able to act. I think a lot of the things that I do are very cat-like in a way, if you like. So I want to think of it more as a spectrum of different forms of agency, many of which we share with other animals. But I also feel like there is something quite specific about the form that agency takes in human beings, without that implying some kind of hierarchy that we're like better than the rest or something. It's just that because of our evolutionary history and cultural evolution as well, probably our agency ended up the way that it is now. And I'm interested in understanding that specificity in action, which I do think involves the notion of intention, without introducing a kind of break in our relationship to all life on Earth and possibly somewhere else.
There's somewhere in the paper, I think they talk about intention as like patterns of something, patterns of organization of pattern. Does that sound familiar? I think this is kind of a really interesting thought that I liked reading that. I'm not sure I can relate it to Anscombe. You could probably do better than me, but in practical knowledge and all of this. But I do like thinking of intention as the organization of patterns, or because in that way that like we could think of it as continuous in a sense of if we think of perception and action, or we just think of cognition and perception and action as ways we're looking at how a creature makes its way, whatever creature that is.
Mhm.
And we would first have to determine the body and the environment in the way that we were saying before. And there would be certain statistical regularities that this creature is encountering, be it a human, a dog, an insect. And their sort of organization of those relative to their body would be its cognition. Knowledge doesn't necessarily mean that you're aware via language or something like this. So a
Mhm.
creature's movement through its world is its knowledge, it's its cognition from our perspective, maybe not from its perspective. But how do you see this patterns of organization and action in relation to Anscombe?
I mean, certainly that's I guess one of the central pieces of her account, and it's kind of hard to just summarize in a few words, because I guess she also thought that you kind of have to do the work yourself and reading through the book and trying to really understand where she's coming from. But I guess the basic idea is that she wants to think of intention as a kind of form that actions take in the way that they're related to each other in terms of means and ends. So that when there is an intentional action, you can usually describe what's going on as saying this person or this animal does that in order to achieve something else. And then there's the notion of practical knowledge, which is also absolutely essential to Anscombe, which is related to this in the sense that she wants to say that when someone is doing something intentionally, they are aware of how what they're doing right now is a means to an end that they want to achieve. And that's sort of, in that sense, the practical knowledge, like when you do something, you know what you're doing and you know why you're doing it. That's constituent for her, I think, of acting intentionally. And she thinks that she can bring that out by looking at the way in which people answer this why question. If I catch you walking down the stairs and I say, what are you doing? Or why are you doing this? If you reply something like, oh, I wasn't aware that I was walking down the stairs, or maybe I just woke you up from sleepwalking. That answer, Anscombe thinks, shows that what you were doing, you weren't really doing it intentionally. You weren't doing it based on knowing what you're doing in that situation. Whereas if you said, I'm going to fetch some milk from the shop, or like I'm going down in order to go to the shop, that's an answer that in a sense reveals this pattern being present of you being aware of how what you're doing right now contributes to achieving a goal that you care about. And I think in a sense, Anscombe thinks that working out the structure of this teleological, goal, means and end oriented pattern really is all we have to say in order to understand the notion of intention. And just to try to bring that back to the paper, the reason why it's nice for ecological psychology is that this is a kind of non-representational way of thinking of the notion of intention. You don't have to think of intention as some kind of mental state that is present at the time at which someone is acting, and that then somehow causes you to act. But at the same time, thinking in Anscombian terms about intentions in terms of sort of forms of descriptions or patterns of organization of action is often a bit unusual and obscure, and it takes a while to get into it. And I'm certainly still struggling to fit that view into a naturalistic understanding of intentional action, where we do have to look at, how is the body of the agent actually constructed? What role does the nervous system play in the production of intelligent behavior? All these are, from a naturalistic perspective, essential questions to answer. The question, what is intentional action?
You said you want to try to think of a naturalistic notion of intention. What do you mean by naturalistic for those who, what's like your way of thinking about that word?
That's another big question. I don't think I can or want to give a definite answer to that. But I guess most generally, I just think of it as a notion of intention that is compatible or supported by our knowledge from the natural sciences, and in particular biology and the bunch of disciplines that make up cognitive science, like psychology and neuroscience and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for me,
so
that has to do with organization of patterns too. I could see how we
yeah,
think
absolutely.
of naturalistic in a sense of having noticed
Yeah.
patterns or having observed patterns and having maybe even data and tested them, and the kind of scientific method could be understood in that way, which is really far away from the way someone might just think of intention in an everyday sense, which actually feels like this mental inner kind of thing that's going on. But what I think this paper is trying to do is collapse that a bit through this notion of intention as that they're getting from Anscombe, and it seems connected in a way to naturalizing intention, because what it's doing is it's saying, okay, we can observe something as intention without it being necessarily something that the subject is aware of, holding in like present with at the moment that it's taking place or something. But then when you zoom out and you look at it through scales, you can see the trajectory, you can see the pattern of organization, but it doesn't mean the person or the agent necessarily has to hold all that in some kind of mental realm while it's happening.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I'm interested in the idea of thinking of these kind of patterns of organization of actions in terms of means and ends that Anscombe is trying to describe as, in many cases, very strongly embodied, like in the sense that your body knows what you're doing when you do something intentionally, and that the way in which, for example, when you're walking along across the street intentionally, an absolutely central part of that action is the way in which your legs and arms and whole movement of your body are coordinated to produce that goal-directed behavior. I mean, of course, you're aware in some sense that you're walking down the street, but to me, it's much more plausible to say my body is walking, or my knowledge of how to walk down the street is really just in my body. That's what I've been doing my whole life since I'm, I don't know, one and a half years old or something. And I don't need to think about that in some kind of abstract, detached way, and that you then might want to describe in terms of beliefs about what you're doing and stuff like that. So I'm very interested in this idea of thinking about practical knowledge, which, as I said, is essential, at least on Anscombe's view, to intentional action as something that is very much embodied, and that these cycles of organization of action are ingrained in the structure of our body.
I'm so glad you said the word embodied. We've been talking about the body a lot, which is also very important in all these other contexts, but this is going to be a little messy, but I just have to try to kind of go for it a bit, because this idea that you're talking about in this kind of continuum and it being embodied, the organizational pattern is embodied, and that becomes the main problem, right? And all these things of how do you go from this embodied cognition that's not necessarily it's about the subject, but it's not necessarily about what we think of as subjective awareness, of having awareness that you are acting in a certain way. And those always seem very distinct. But I think what I'm seeing, and what I think a lot of people are trying to get at, is that this is a continuous process with that embodied cognition. You, as a little boy, developed your way of, you made way in physically how to get to the park, but also in terms of your emotions and your thoughts and all of this, right? And you, through language, sort of developed in the same way an awareness of your organization of those patterns via language, which makes us start to feel like, oh, there's like a little me in my head or something. But really, it's just this kind of, we've organized our patterns of behavior via language in the same way that we organize our patterns in our body as we walk, and we learn this. So there becomes this continuity between life and mind, and a continuity between the way we make our way physically and the way that we come to understand ourselves through awareness via language or something. But this is where it gets
Mm.
tricky, doesn't it? When you start to think of my dog or your dog or an insect or something, you really have to think, okay, they're doing the same thing with their body, and that's cognition, but there's a very different sort of language. There probably is language, but it's not what we call human language. So their awareness of their patterns would be different, even if the organizing pattern is similar. This gets very hard to talk about, and we get really confused. We have trouble not thinking of everything in terms of language-based thought or something. So something like practical knowledge, I feel like it's really tied. I mean, it makes sense with Wittgenstein and her coming out of that it would be so tied to language in a way. But I feel like, and this paper is sort of trying to do it, that we could almost try to unstick the language, understand that that's one form of waymaking and one form of knowledge, therefore, one form of practical knowledge. But there's also a practical knowledge in the very way that she introduces it that isn't about being aware through language of your actions, but that could still be very relative to this pattern formation through just aligning with what you've been moving through your whole life, whether you're a cell or a human. And I know that's very messy, but I feel like it's not just language based, and it seems very language based still in her work. But maybe I'm wrong because I haven't read her as much as you. Trying to get past that.
I think this is something that I have to think more about, and that I would love to reread also aspects of Anscombe. And I think one thing that she does think is that it is essential to the kind of practical knowledge that is constitutive or very important to make sense of intentional actions, at least in humans, that we are able to express to others our reasons for doing what we did intentionally. This is why this why question is so central, because Anscombe seems to think that it is essential to you're being an intentional agent capable of acting intentional, that you also are able to answer that question if I ask you why did you do that. And I love that you mentioned language there, because of course that is, you know, the way that we typically communicate our reasons to each other for what we are doing. But another thing that I've been really interested in that relates to that is that language, and also this why question, is something that only really matters in a social context, right? So normally you wouldn't really ask yourself, why am I doing this? And you don't really, there is a sense in which you don't really have to make explicit or express to yourself the reasons for why you're doing something. I mean, that might be related to this kind of obscure notion of Anscombe, that she wants to think of practical knowledge as what she calls knowledge without observation, as, you know, the way that you know what you're doing is not through observing yourself and then making explicit to yourself, oh, there is a body that's moving in the world and has these certain kinds of features.
That's very good. Knowledge without observation. Yeah, that's because that's different than being able to answer the why question. Just like the water pump example. If what is that? Like there's a guy pumping poisonous water into a house, and if you ask him why he's doing it, he can answer it. And there's this kind of whole train of why questions. That's kind of the famous example. I can link to it. But in any case, I was imagining that is the same as understanding why you're doing it. It's not at all, actually. Or observing yourself. Well,
no,
being the observer.
It is essential. I think it's essential to that example and other cases of intentional action that the person, or this man in this case, knows what he's doing in pumping water into a house.
His answer is, I want to kill the family inside or something, I think, right? That's why he's pumping poisonous water or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the idea of knowledge without observation is that when you ask him, why are you doing this? He's able to answer that question, not because he's sort of looking at himself from a third person perspective and observing what's going on as happenings in the world that lead towards there being poison in a house that is connected to a pump that he happens to be operating. But he knows what he's doing without observation, as Anscombe says. He just has this well, embodied know-how, you could maybe call it. That's sort of the way that I like to think about it. Because he has that knowledge without observation, that he's able to answer the why question immediately when you ask him. But yeah, I mean, in that example again, it's just sort of essential to there being practical knowledge that he's able to express his reasons for doing something in some sense, based on a kind of knowledge that is not based on his observation of himself.
Yeah, and as you said, it's a social, I think in a way there's that loops also. I mean, as you said, this is a social thing we don't really ask ourselves, but actually I would kind of push back on that a bit too, because I think part of the social reason we ask each other is to awaken the individual to start asking that question for themselves, which we do usually, maybe as children, because we realize we're part of the social environment and we have to appear in a certain way, or we have to be able to say like what we're doing. You know, once we start asking those questions, it changes that cognition of self in a very particular sense. That's what law is in a way. It's that asking why and having to answer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do think that's why it's so important to look at social interaction, especially also in early development, in order to understand the notion of intentional action, because through being forced to justify your actions or explain your actions to others, you also, I think, gain a sort of different relationship to your own actions, that when you then start doing or do something, you're able to in some sense ask yourself, why am I doing this? Or perhaps in a different way, ask yourself, if someone were asking me, what would I say?
Yeah, it's very complicated, because the man pumping water, for example, if you ask him why, he might not tell you the truth of why. He might tell you, I'm just pumping water to help them or something. There's all kind of weird loops, which the more aware you become, the more you observe these kind of patterns or your own knowledge, the more your knowledge changes, and the more you could use that in different ways, right? The more you can shift perspectives and see how others might see you and what you should, It reminds me a little bit of, to go back to von Uxkol again, of he talks about the Umwelt, but he talks about two different kinds. I think it's Werkwelt, it's in German, Werkwelt and Merkwelt, maybe. And one of them is more like practical knowledge, as I see it. This Werk is more like the agent in its environment, aligning with its sensory regularities and developing organizational patterns. And you don't need, it doesn't need to observe it in the sense that we're talking about. And then the Merkt would be the observation, and it's more symbolic or semiotic. There's some kind of symbol, like language would be attached. That makes sense with language and a meaning, and all the stuff gets ascribed to it. So I guess what I'm trying to push at is, can we, when it gets back to the paper and trying to think of perception and action and as ecological and bringing intention into that, can we imagine that there's a sense in which this is a kind of a scaling or a continuity, not a linear kind of thing?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to. Yeah, I mean, what I said before about this notion of practical knowledge being somehow embodied, or something that we don't really have to make explicit. And then on the other hand, having the capacity to make it explicit in terms of language. The way I sort of think about it now is that like you said, it's not like a linear progression or a kind of sharp distinction between one kind of practical knowledge and the other, but that they are sort of intertwined in the way that we act and in the way that we explain ourselves to others. But that in order to make sense of that relationship, it's not enough to just look at individuals, but you also have to look at how they interact with other individuals, or you have to take into account the social dimension.
It gets back to what we were talking about with, it very much, I think, inspired this ecological notion of affordance, or something like a niche construction that's often connected to it. Yeah, it's the way in which, as you're saying, in the context or these particular atmosphere of affordances for a particular body, as we were saying, are always different. How that actually can't be disengaged from one's development of intention, and also how one uses something symbolic like language in order to observe that intention, even if it's not in oneself. I think with what we were talking about earlier too, we often think that means the subject is observing themselves, but there's can be observation that's not from the agent that's being observed. That would still, we could still imagine that's intention, especially when it comes to something like law. You might be able to observe a trajectory and call it intentional and directed, without necessarily the agent themselves having an awareness of that trajectory. But then that's not the same as the everyday use of intention, that I intended to hurt them and therefore I made this action.
Yeah, I think that's a whole nother field that I would love to know more about, how, because the idea to me that in a trial, for example, you're trying to figure out whether there was intention present and whether and what the intention was. As I guess, for example, in the Trump trial, they need to somehow prove that he was aware of what he was doing in inciting that. And in some sense, they're trying to, I think, prove, that he did what he did intentionally and posting all these messages and so on.
And the
But
way
to
they
me,
probably would prove that is through language, that he spoke or wrote or said something to someone. Yeah, that's true.
yeah, in the sense that they're trying, that's what they're trying to, a part of what they're trying to prove. But this idea to me that you're looking at all these thousands of pieces of information and videos and whatever in order to then retrospectively say, oh yeah, that person did what they did intentionally, and therefore they are culpable, and so on. That is like really fascinating, but also quite perplexing, because there is a sense in which I don't think it really gets at what actually happened at that time or went through the person's mind as they did it, which again,
Wow.
Anscombe's idea that, it's not really about that when we want to think about intention.
Yeah,
But
as you
anyway,
speak, I'm reminded of this video I just saw just randomly. I think I was in like an airport or something, but they were interviewing one of the guys from that who went into the Capitol, and they were trying to kind of say, oh, you were just like brainwashed by all of this propaganda that was directing your actions, or you weren't really intending it. And he was saying, no, I knew what I was doing. I did it on my own. Nobody brainwashed me. And that gets very tricky too, doesn't it? Because we think we choose sometimes, but we've just absorbed a certain trajectory of media that is leading us, but we are also at the same time making the decision to be led. So you have to get beyond that dichotomy of it only being one way or the other, that someone else, or that the inertia of the trajectory is what's leading you, and that's the intention. So your intention is like somehow the inertia of a larger intention, for example, the Trump campaign, versus that you somehow can distinguish between those wider intentions, social intentions, and your own intention. I mean, that too is really quite interesting. And I think it also brings us to the paper again about perception and action. And like, how do we really distinguish between perception and action? The ecological theory would say perception is action. It is an activity. It's doing something. It's not something that's happening in some inner world or something. The paper says it's going to define intention, or that it could, Anscombe's theory could sort of define intention in a way. Did you really get that? Like what that definition was in the end? I mean, we've been dancing around all these possibilities.
Anscombe's understanding of intention, well, this is the reason it's kind of difficult, because Anscombe doesn't really provide, if you like, a kind of positive account of what intention is in terms of the necessary and sufficient conditions for there being an intention present, and so on. And she has this sort of very Wittgenstein-inspired approach of looking at the way in which we use the expression intention, or someone acted intentionally, or the notion of intentional action in everyday language, in the way that we talk about actions and explain our actions to others, in order to work out this kind of pattern that she thinks is present, that I've tried to elaborate a little bit on. This is why reading Anscombe is often a bit frustrating, and at the same time extremely fascinating and inspiring, because she doesn't really give you that direct answer. I think the authors also are very aware of, that they talk about in the end of the paper, of integrating the Anscombian kind of approach to intention with, let's say, a more empirically oriented scientific approach to agency. And yeah, I think they do say that there is still a lot of work to be done in that direction, but it's an interesting, proposal to try to bring Anscombe's perspective into that field in order to try to think about intention in different ways, and in particular to get away from this idea of it being some kind of mental state or representation in the minds of an agent.
I found it hard to really understand what they were offering as the definition of intention. But I feel like in the abstract, they say that they're going to, let's see, we will argue that Anscombe's account can meet the two challenges of bringing intentions into the framework of ecological psychology. First, it can explain what intentions are, if not representational states. Okay. So I guess we've kind of talked about that, right? It's not necessarily explaining or giving a definition of intention so much as showing that it doesn't have to be representational, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way of putting it. It's probably not the right way to think about Anscombe's account in this sort of positive way of giving you a theory of that's his intention. Even though in some sense, of course, she does give you some kind of conception of that notion that is illuminating. But yeah, I think what they want to say in the paper as I read it is that her way of approaching it is in principle a lot more compatible than with ecological psychology than the kind of standard approaches in the philosophy of action.
Broadly, I can start to understand how we might imagine intention as these patterns of activity that are these organizational patterns of activity. I could understand how that relates to basically just the statistical regularities of what is encountered from a particular body as it's making its way, and how the organization of that, the body is the organizer of that, is perception and action, depending which way you want to look at it. So of course there's a kind of directedness or intention of the body. Even it doesn't necessarily have to be goal oriented. Like the body has to make its way, and you develop a kind of directedness as you do that, because you do create these patterns that are organizational.
And also one of the potential criticisms that someone might level against the paper when it is precisely hanging on that question of whether you want to think of this making way or moving around in the world in an intentional kind of way as involving goals, as being teleological means and goal directed. And I guess for Anscombe, that notion of a goal is absolutely essential to making sense of intention. So if you want to take her approach at sort of face value, I guess you would have to provide some kind of naturalistic explanation or incorporate this notion of teleology or goal directedness into whatever your scientific framework is, if you want to take her kind of approach on board. And that might involve explaining away the notion of goal in some other kind of way, or just embracing the notion of organisms as teleological goal-oriented systems, which is something that I guess Enactivism does and has been criticized a lot for.
When we're talking about making way or navigation as cognition, when we're looking at cognition, which for me means how any agent is making its way through whatever encounter it finds itself in, there's always someone is assessing that. So from the point of view of the assessor, the person who's doing the assessing, there will always be teleology. There will always be some possibility of a goal, because you can see the trajectory and you're looking at one particular trajectory. So I guess what I want to do is open up like the scale of that. So that's not the only way of looking at that agent and that behavior or that perception or that action, whatever it is you're looking at. It's one way, and it's probably like, depending on how you've framed it and what you're looking for, you can put it in those terms, but it's not always and only that. Sometimes there's just wandering. Sometimes we're lost, and I mean that in all kinds of different ways. And this too is a form of waymaking, and there can be intention ascribed to it. I think that's what I was saying before. The fact that its intention can be ascribed to it doesn't mean that it's intention for the agent in question. But that would be a whole other thing. But it's interesting that you say, so for Anscombe, there's always a goal, you would say. There's always teleology in your reading of it.
Yeah, although again, this is like very takes us or would take us into some kind of deep territory about the way that people read Anscombe, and there's different interpretations of that, and I'm not really sure what mine is or what the correct one is, whatever. But yeah, for her, this kind of pattern or structure that she's trying to describe, which she thinks is essential to the notion of intention, that is a teleological pattern. So it is this idea that when someone is doing something intentionally, you can describe what they're doing as something that they're doing in order to do something else. So you're explaining, in some sense, what they're doing right now by appealing to some future action or state of affairs that hasn't realized itself yet, but that in some sense explains what's happening at the moment and identifies what's happening at the moment as an intentional action. And so in order to make sense of that kind of pattern, you need that kind of teleological, goal-oriented kind of explanation. And if you ignore that and you want to say, no, everything is purely causal, mechanistic, physical, and we need to understand organisms on that reductive basis, and there's no teleology allowed at all, it's just a metaphor, it's just a way of speaking about living organisms, then I think it becomes very hard to incorporate the kind of Anscombian approach to intention and perhaps agency more general within a scientific framework, if that's the way that you want to think about
it's well
nature.
Said. It makes me think of a million things.
I loved what you said about this this idea of that sometimes we are lost, and sometimes we're like, doing something, but we don't necessarily have a particular kind of goal in mind or particular kind of intention in mind. And I think that these are actually quite central moments in our life as agents, because
Absolutely.
it's sort of,
digression. That's how many things are discovered. That's what this is.
Yeah. I was actually reading Walden yesterday, because it's kind of my
wonderful.
My good night book at the moment. I've been reading it for over a year now. It's a little piece of cake that I'm always, and there was one section in it that I marked because I thought it would be relevant to our discussion, and it's actually exactly about the kind of thing that you said, which I really love, because it made me think about, well, doing something in a different way, it made me think about the notion of intention in a different way. In these moments when we lost. And so he's saying, and I'll quote, not till we are lost. In other words, not till we have lost the world do we begin to find ourselves and realize where we are and the infinite extent of our relations. End quote. And I love that. And he's like talking about this in the context of explaining. He's like describing how he walks back at night to his little hut at Walden Pond and finding his way in pitch black, just, feeling the path that his way-making trips back and forth have made over the last month. And he's like describing this moment of just, kind of losing where you are, but you're still, in some sense, you're still an agent in the world. You're still trying to make sense of what's going on. And in some sense, you're actually creating on the spot the meaning that you find in that situation. And I think that these moments of being lost, but still acting with the kind of directedness and intentionality, they're quite central to the idea of enaction, of bringing forth a world, of bringing forth meaning through the kind of activity that you do as an organism. So
thank you for that. Thank you so much. That's so good and so true. Because as scientists or philosophers who work in scientific environments, or even just like a society that's geared towards science and should be, we want to have teleology, even if we call it, or we want to have patterns, or we want to have that's what we're looking for. It doesn't mean we're finding our way, and it doesn't mean we're navigating, but we have to, there's no choice but to make way through the encounter. That is life. It's making way. And it's not intentional always that we've decided which way we're going to make. And all of that is so rich. I guess this gets to the beyond dichotomy too. I don't see that we have to say that because a teleology can be from some particular position or scale discovered, that it's going to apply to all scales. Just the same way that a body is made up of cells, and there will be particular things for the body that don't apply to the cell, weirdly, or vice versa. But they're still the same process from some other perspective. That's a really hard thing to hold in mind, and that's what we need new models to understand. So reading these papers through, this idea of agency, it's interesting to bring that back. And you're saying you see that always in a goal-oriented sense.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think I or the authors of that paper would want to say that every organism, even every organism of the same species, has the same kinds of goals. In that sense, obviously there are many teleologies, if you like. But I think what I was more trying to say is that when you think about the notion of agency quite generally, at least I find it quite hard to make sense of that without involving some notion of a goal or of a purpose, which to me always doesn't mean that you're sort of that you've left the field of natural science. It's just that's a sort of fact about how we understand the concept of agency, and that needs to be explained. But it's sort of important to acknowledge that when you start thinking about a concept that's so difficult, rather than trying to reduce it to something else that is completely devoid of any kind of goal directedness, because then agency just kind of seems to, for me at least, my intuitive grasp on the concept seems to kind of fade out of the picture.
Yeah, I worry sometimes about, a lot of these approaches are, once we start thinking, of course, teleology is still naturalistic science and all of this, it can be, but I do think we have to use caution in this rigidity of, often when we talk about these words, we do talk about them in a dichotomous way, so that it's either or, and that there's only one teleology, or somehow we find the right goal or the right, or, and I guess what I want to do is that's why I said teleologies, not teleology, but is, of course, from, as I was saying, from any position of assessment, we could see goals, but we can't always ascribe that goal to the thing that we're assessing. I think we have to be very, very careful about that. Something like von Uexküll, for example, once you start doing that, you get into really dangerous areas, which he did. He had all these crazy ideas, political ideas that were really detrimental and wrong, that were very, very tied to believing, we can determine what a goal is for some agent. So I guess that's where I'm trying to open up the space where it's too easy to say everything is goal-oriented and only goal-oriented. It's better for me to say the measuring or the science is always going to be able to see particular goals when assessing particular trajectories. But the overall bigger model, we have to remember, is not linear ever. And you can always see many, many overlapping trajectories that then needs a new model for how we understand what all of this is, this waymaking, which isn't necessarily a linear movement from some place to a goal. That mindset is what bothers me, and what is we can so easily get stuck in, I think, through these very inspirational and true ideas. A lot of the people that inspired me got stuck in those places, and it's hard to, I don't want to do that.
I really like your idea, as far as we've talked about it, of waymaking, because it does always involve this historical dimension that makes it very unique to each individual. We all have come our own way to where we are today, and we will all go different paths, which sometimes cross and sometimes they don't. But there's the sense that the kinds of goals that we care about and that we do pursue and that guide our behavior, they are very much tied to the kind of individual that we have become and that we are in the process of becoming.
Right.
And in
So
that sense, I completely agree. I completely agree that it's treacherous to sort of think of teleology as this one thing that applies to all.
Right. There could be even
Yeah.
contradictory teleologies within the same agent, as part of the same agency. I guess it's just the rigidity of thinking that we're going to look at this system and we were looking at everything. And so if we find the goals of that system, then we've somehow solved something for multiple perspectives. It gets to what we were talking about the cognition of how you can apply human cognition to a dog or whatever, in terms of if you're going to punish them. It's more that I feel like we need more nuance in terms of understanding that there's always multiple goals and multiple trajectories of getting to any one particular goal. And the goal itself might look like a goal from one perspective and from another not. I guess I'm just trying to open up that space, but I do want to get your opinion or your perspective about this notion of whether we need affordances to have intention, because that's also raised in the paper. And I feel like the authors say you can have intentions they don't depend on the affordances.
I think the point they make is they want to say that intentional action doesn't always depend on affordances being present at that moment that are relevant to what you're trying to achieve. So I think they have this example of someone looking to cut an onion or something, or wanting to cut an onion, but there's no knife present in the kitchen. So they're just exploring the environment, right, looking for something to cut the onion. Even though in that particular case there is nothing there that affords them to cut with. And they say that it's not necessary for that being an object that affords cutting in order to speak about there being an intentional action, and perhaps even the intention of cutting an onion that is being sort of realized through exploring the environment in order to find something that you can cut an onion with.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's the presence of affordances in that moment. So that would again go to that trajectory and that history, that at some point you've understood, you've had a knife to cut the onion. So that would be sort of where the directedness is coming from, but that doesn't mean that then the tool itself is present. I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think the other idea that's really central they want to bring in is what we said earlier, that intentions do modulate the affordances that we do actually perceive, and that this is sort of the central fact that they think is important to take account of, and that's why you need to start thinking about intentions. Yeah, I guess they want to say that, adopting the kind of Anscombian approach can give an explanation of that without thinking of intentions as internal representations of goals that are somehow projected onto the environment, but it's rather that because when you're engaged in a particular kind of goal-oriented behavior where you're doing something in order to do something else, like exploring the environment for looking for something to drink, this intention, this like teleological connection between the actions that you are trying to sort of trace out in time in order to reach your goal, that actually restricts which affordances you perceive.
Like you were saying at the beginning, if you arrive in a brand new city but you're thirsty,
yeah, exactly,
you're going to be focused on finding something to drink, not exploring the beauties of the city or whatever.
And so they want to, I think, as I understand it, they want to use Anscombe in that way to keep hold of the idea of direct perception, that affordances are perceived directly rather than through some mediating representational process, whilst also accommodating the idea that our intentions affect which affordances we perceive at any particular moment in time. I have to read it again to think about it, but I mean, on the first pass, I thought it was very plausible, interesting proposal.
Yeah, it's great to have Anscombe brought in like this, and I think that's really rich. I think they say it in the paper, there's tons more that could be explored. Did this paper give you anything new in your work?
As the authors also say in the conclusion of that paper, it's more a beginning, than a conclusive account of intention or something, because you have to really do the work of trying to integrate the kind of Anscombian understanding of intention with there's a naturalistic or scientific or empirical or whatever you want to call it understanding of cognition and the mind and the body. And that's certainly something that I'm very interested in, and I think it's important, and that we should take an interdisciplinary approach to that question, and cognition in general. I mean, this is why I loved, meeting you and talking to you, and thinking about, beyond dichotomies, beyond disciplinary boundaries, and trying to think about this in different ways that are maybe raising eyebrows, but can lead to new things.
That's the point, just to kind of question
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
ask and explore. So thanks for
Yeah, absolutely.
offering this paper. I mean, you came up with it.
Yeah, thanks
It was
for
a great one.
discussing it. It was great. Yeah.
Yes. Till next
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I hope you have a good evening.